The setting sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Silver Creek, its golden rays glinting off the saloon windows like warning signals. Inside, the usual afternoon bustle had given way to an uneasy silence as 5 rough-looking men swaggered through the swinging doors, their spurs jingling with each deliberate step. These weren't ordinary drifters. The notorious Crowley gang had finally reached Silver Creek, and their reputation had preceded them. Jed Crowley, their leader, stood front and center, his weather-beaten face marked by a jagged scar that seemed to deepen as he sneered at the locals. Outside, at a modest farm stand near the general store, Clara Whitmore arranged her vegetables with careful precision. Her slender frame and simple cotton dress gave no hint of the strength that lay beneath. A worn hat cast shadows across her face, hiding eyes that missed nothing. The gang's raucous laughter spilled into the street as they emerged from the saloon. Jed's gaze landed on Clara's stand, and a cruel smile spread across his face. "Well, boys," he drawled, loud enough for everyone to hear, "looks like we've found ourselves some entertainment." The Outlaws surrounded Clara's stand, knocking over baskets of fresh produce. "Careful with those," Clara said quietly, her voice steady despite the threat looming over her. This only made them laugh harder. "Oh, she's got spirit, boys," Jed mocked, picking up an apple and taking a deliberately messy bite. "Tell me, little lady, what else can those delicate hands do besides picking vegetables?" Clara straightened slowly, brushing dust from her apron. "I can shoot," she replied simply. The statement hung in the air for a moment before the gang erupted in laughter. "Did you hear that?" Jed wheezed, wiping tears from his eyes. "The farmer's daughter thinks she can shoot." "Maybe she means shooting peas at the dinner table," one of his men quipped, causing another round of laughter. Jed's eyes gleamed with malicious amusement. "Tell you what, sweetheart, let's make this interesting. See that weather vane on top of the church?" He pointed to a tiny metal rooster barely visible in the distance. "Hit that, and I'll pay double for every vegetable in your stand. Miss, and well—" His hand rested meaningfully on his holster. Clara's expression remained unchanged as she studied the distant target. The crowd that had gathered held their breath, some whispering prayers for the young woman's safety, others shaking their heads at her foolishness. What happened next would be talked about in Silver Creek for years to come. But before we continue this incredible story, tell us in the comments below. Have you ever been underestimated and proved everyone wrong? Share your story. We'd love to hear how you showed your true strength when others least expected it. Clara's hand moved with the fluid grace of a rushing stream, drawing her pistol so smoothly it seemed to materialize in her grip. The Outlaw's smirks froze on their faces as she raised the weapon without hesitation, her stance betraying years of practice that no simple farmer's daughter should possess. "That weather was awful far," Jed taunted, though a flicker of uncertainty crossed his scarred face. "Maybe we should start you with something easier, like—" The crack of the shortcut threw his words like thunder. The weather vane spun wildly, the metal rooster dancing as Clara's bullet found its mark with deadly precision. Before the echo of the first shot had faded, she fired again and again, each bullet striking the distant target with impossible accuracy. A hush fell over the crowd. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Jed's confident smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of growing unease as he realized his mistake. This was no ordinary farmer's daughter. "Lucky shot," one of his men muttered, but his voice trembled with doubt. Clara lowered her smoking pistol, her movements deliberate and controlled. "Luck had nothing to do with it," she said softly. "Would you like to see what I can do with moving targets?" Without waiting for a response, she turned and fired 6 rapid shots. Each bullet found a different target: a tin can tossed by the wind, a rope holding a shop sign, even a playing card that had blown from the saloon's poker table. Each shot was more impossible than the last, yet Clara hit them all with the casual ease of someone swatting flies. The memory of her father's words echoed in her mind. "Shooting isn't about strength, Clara. It's about patience, precision, and knowing exactly who you are." John Whitmore had been the finest marksman west of the Mississippi, and he'd passed every secret, every technique, every hard-earned lesson to his daughter before Outlaws had gunned him down 5 years ago. Jed Crowley's hand twitched near his holster, but Clara's eyes caught the movement. "I wouldn't," she warned, her voice carrying the same quiet deadliness as her father's had. "I've got 5 bullets left, and I never waste a shot." The truth of her words hung heavy in the air. Everyone present knew they'd just witnessed something extraordinary. This wasn't just skill. This was mastery born from countless hours of practice, honed by determination and grief. "Who are you?" Jed demanded, his earlier mockery replaced by a mix of fear and fascination. Clara finally lifted her hat, revealing eyes that held the sharp focus of a hawk and the cold calculation of a wolf. "Just a farmer's daughter," she replied, "who learned early that in this world, it's not about who you appear to be, but who you truly are." The Outlaws backed away slowly, their previous bravado shattered by the revelation of what they'd unknowingly challenged. But this was far from over. In their retreat, Clara saw the burning humiliation in Jed's eyes. She knew well enough that men like him didn't take such defeats lightly. The afternoon stretched taut like a bowstring as Jed Crowley's gang regrouped near their horses, casting dark glances toward Clara's stand. The townsfolk had begun to whisper among themselves, sharing fragments of stories they'd heard about John Whitmore's legendary marksmanship and his mysterious daughter. Jed's voice cut through the murmurs, loud and deliberate. "Fine shooting, girl, real fine." His tone carried a venomous edge that made several townspeople step back. "But skill with a gun doesn't mean much when you're sleeping. Be a shame if something happened to that nice little farm of yours. Fires start awfully easy in this dry weather." Clara continued arranging her vegetables, her movements unhurried despite the threat. "That's the second mistake you've made today, Mr. Crowley," she said, her voice carrying across the sudden silence. "First, I thought I couldn't shoot. Second is thinking I won't be ready for you." She straightened up, fixing him with a stare that had grown men backing away. "Cross me, and you'll regret it. That's not a threat. It's a promise my father taught me to keep." The mention of her father sparked recognition in Jed's eyes. His face darkened as connections formed in his mind. "Whitmore," he spat. "John Whitmore's kid. Should have known by the way you handle that iron." His hand unconsciously touched the scar on his face. "Your pa gave me this before he died. Seems fitting I should return the favor to his precious daughter." "My father's dead," Clara replied coldly, "but his lessons live on. Care to find out just how well he taught me?" The tension crackled like lightning before a storm. Townsfolk scattered, ducking into doorways and behind water troughs. They'd seen standoffs before, but something about this one felt different, more personal, more deadly. One of Jed's men, younger and more reckless than the others, reached for his gun. Before his fingers could close around the grip, Clara's weapon appeared as if by magic. "That would be your last mistake," she warned, her aim unwavering. "And I do mean last." The young outlaw froze, sweat beading on his forehead as he realized how close to death he'd just stepped. Jed grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Not here," he growled. "Not now." Clara watched them mount up, her stance relaxed but ready. As they rode past her stand, Jed reined his horse in close. "This ain't over, girl. You might be quick, might be deadly, but everybody's got to sleep sometime. And when you do..." He left the threat hanging in the air. "Sleep tight yourself, Mr. Crowley," Clara replied softly, "and check your barn before you go to bed. Never know what might be waiting in the shadows." The outlaws rode off in a cloud of dust, but their departure didn't ease the tension. If anything, it grew heavier. The townsfolk knew this was just the beginning, the calm before a storm that would shake Silver Creek to its foundations. As the dust settled from the Crowley gang's departure, Sheriff Tom Morgan approached Clara's stand, his weathered face etched with concern. "You just stirred up a hornet's nest, girl," he said quietly. "Jed Crowley ain't the type to let this slide." Clara met his gaze steadily. "I know what kind of man he is, Sheriff. Same kind that killed my father." She began packing up her remaining vegetables, her movements precise and controlled. "What they don't know is what kind of woman I am." The sheriff removed his hat, running a hand through his graying hair. "Your father was the best shot I ever saw. John Whitmore could hit a playing card edge on at 50 paces, but even he trailed off, not wanting to finish the thought. "Even he died," Clara completed the sentence for him. "Because he was alone that night, because he didn't expect them to come for him." Her voice carried the weight of 5 years of grief and determination. "I've made sure not to repeat his mistakes." Word spread through town like wildfire, and soon the truth about Clara emerged. After her father's death, she hadn't just mourned, she'd transformed herself. Every dawn found her practicing, hours before the farm work began. Every dusk saw her shooting by candlelight, perfecting her draw until it became faster than thought itself. "She's better than John ever was," old Pete Watson told anyone who'd listen at the saloon that evening. "Saw her once, out by the creek, hit 6 bottles tossed in the air, reloaded, and hit 6 more before the first pieces hit the ground. Never seen anything like it." Others shared their own stories. How Clara could shoot a rattler's head off without harming a single scale on its body. How she'd once picked off 3 wolves threatening her cattle, each shot finding its mark in the dark of night. But it wasn't just her accuracy that made her deadly. It was her patience, her calculation, her absolute control. "John taught her everything he knew," Martha from the general store added. "But she took it further. They say she can read a man's intentions in the twitch of his trigger finger, see the path of a bullet before it's fired." As these tales circulated, a fuller picture emerged of the quiet farmer's daughter who'd hidden her true nature for so long. After her father's murder, Clara had thrown herself into mastering not just marksmanship, but strategy. She studied the ways of predators, learning to think like them, to anticipate their moves. She transformed their modest farm into a fortress, though none who passed by would ever notice. Faster than any man west of the Mississippi became the whispered consensus, and twice as dangerous because no one expects it. Back at her farm, Clara went about her evening chores as usual. But those who looked closely might notice the subtle signs, the strategically placed mirrors catching the last light of day, the carefully maintained clear lines of sight from the house to every approach, the way she seemed to know exactly where every sound came from. She wasn't just John Whitmore's daughter anymore. She was his legacy and his vengeance. In a ramshackle cabin 5 miles outside of Silver Creek, Jed Crowley paced like a caged mountain lion, his boots wearing a path in the wooden floor. The rest of his gang watched nervously, none daring to speak as their leader's rage simmered. "A farmer's daughter," he spat, kicking over a chair. "Made fools of us in front of the whole damn town." His hand unconsciously touched the scar on his face, the mark John Whitmore had left him years ago. Should have known she was his blood the moment she drew that gun. Snake Eye Pete, his most trusted man, cleared his throat. "Boss, maybe we should just move on. Plenty of other towns." The sound of Jed's fist hitting the table silenced him. "Move on, move on." Jed's voice rose to a roar. "First the father marks me, now the daughter shames me? No, the Whitmore name dies tonight." He spread a crude map across the table, his finger jabbing at the location of Clara's farm. "That girl thinks she's clever, thinks she's ready for us, but no one can watch every direction at once." The outlaws gathered around as Jed outlined his plan. "Pete, you and Mac take the north side, near the creek. Billy, you and Carter circle round to the barn. Me and Jackson, I'll come in from the south. We wait till she's sleeping, then hit all at once." "What about the mirrors she's got set up?" Billy asked, nervously chewing on a piece of tobacco. "Saw 'em when we rode past. She's got the whole place rigged to catch any movement." Jed's smile was cruel. "That's why we're waiting for the new moon. Total darkness. Her precious mirrors won't help her then." He pulled out a bottle of whiskey, taking a long drink before passing it around. And this time, we finished the job properly. No more Whitmores left to come gunning for us. As the gang prepared their weapons, checking ammunition and sharpening knives, Snake-Eye Pete noticed something odd about Jed's behavior. The boss kept glancing out the window, his hand straying to his gun belt more often than usual. For all his bluster, Pete realized Jed Crowley was scared, and he had reason to be. They all remembered how John Whitmore had died, taking 4 of their old gang with him before the end. If his daughter was even better. "Stay sharp, boys," Jed commanded, strapping on an extra gun belt. "That girl's good with a pistol, I'll give her that. But she's still just one person. Can't watch every shadow, can't stop every bullet." He checked his rifle's action, the click echoing in the cabin. "By sunrise, the only thing folks I'll be saying about Clara Whitmore is what a shame it was that she tried to stand against us." But even as he spoke, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. He'd seen something in Clara's eyes that afternoon, something that went beyond mere skill with a gun, something that reminded him of a wolf sizing up its prey. As darkness fell, the gang mounted up, their horses' hooves muffled by strips of cloth tied around them. They rode out toward the Whitmore farm, unaware they were riding straight into a trap years in the making. The new moon cast no light over the Whitmore farm as Jed's gang approached from 3 directions. The darkness that was supposed to be their ally seemed unusually thick, almost alive with unseen threats. The only sound was the soft whisper of the wind through the corn stalks. "Something ain't right," Snake-Eye Pete whispered, his horse nervously pawing the ground. "It's too quiet." Even the crickets had fallen silent, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Jed silenced him with a harsh gesture. Everything was going according to plan. The farmhouse sat dark and still, no sign of movement within. The barn loomed like a shadow against the star-filled sky. Perfect conditions for an ambush, or so they thought. The first shot came out of nowhere. A muzzle flash briefly illuminating the darkness, followed by the sound of Billy's surprised grunt as he toppled from his saddle. Before the others could react, 2 more shots rang out in rapid succession, each finding its mark with deadly precision. "It's a trap!" Jackson yelled, wheeling his horse around. The animal reared up, silhouetted against the stars. A perfect target. The crack of a rifle echoed across the farm, and both horse and rider went down. Chaos erupted as the remaining outlaws tried to locate their attacker, but Clara wasn't in any one place. She was everywhere and nowhere, her shots coming from different positions, each one calculated to create maximum confusion. "The barn!" Jed shouted, spurring his horse toward what he thought would be cover. As he approached, a thin wire caught the moonlight too late. His horse's legs tangled in it, sending both crashing to the ground. He rolled clear, drawing his gun, only to hear the distinctive click of a hammer being cocked behind him. "I warned you," Clara's voice came soft but clear in the darkness. A lantern flared to life, revealing her standing on the barn's upper level, another rifle trained on the remaining outlaws below. Snake-Eye Pete tried to take advantage of the light, drawing and firing in one smooth motion. But Clara was faster. Her shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around before he hit the dirt. Mac and Carter opened fire, their bullets splintering wood where Clara had been seconds before. But she was already moving, another shot dropping Mac where he stood. "You can't be everywhere!" Jed screamed, firing blindly into the darkness. Clara's response was 3 more shots, each finding its target with surgical precision. Carter's gun went flying from his hand. Pete's second attempt at a shot was cut short. The last remaining gang member threw down his weapon and ran, only to trip over one of the many wires Clara had strategically placed around the farm. In less than 2 minutes, the infamous Crowley gang lay scattered across the Whitmore farm. Some dead, some wounded, all defeated by the very woman they'd come to kill. Jed found himself alone, his back against the barn wall, gun empty, facing the approaching figure of Clara Whitmore. Her eyes reflected the lantern light like a wolf's, and her voice carried the chill of a mountain stream. My father always said overconfidence kills more men than bullets. Clara's boots crunched softly on the scattered straw as she approached Jed, who remained pressed against the barn wall. His scarred face twisted in a mixture of fear and defiance as he realized the full extent of his miscalculation. "How?" he demanded, his voice hoarse. "How did you know we were coming?" His hand clutched his empty gun, knuckling white with tension. Clara's aim never wavered as she closed the distance between them. "You really think you're the first to try? After my father, I made sure I'd never be caught off guard." She gestured slightly with her free hand. "Every approach to this farm is watched. Every shadow holds a surprise. I've spent 5 years preparing for men like you." Jed's eyes darted around, finally seeing what they'd missed in their arrogance. Carefully positioned mirrors caught what little starlight there was, creating a network of visibility. Thin wires crisscrossed strategic points, ready to trip up horses or men. Even the corn rows were planted to create clear shooting lanes. "You're just like your father," Jed spat, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. "Too clever for your own good, but he died all the same." Clara's finger tightened imperceptibly on the trigger. "My father died because he was alone that night, because he trusted too much in people's basic decency." Her voice carried the weight of years of grief and determination. "I won't make that mistake!" Suddenly, Jed lunged forward, drawing a hidden knife from his boot. But Clara had anticipated this too. She sidestepped with fluid grace, her pistol cracking once. The knife flew from Jed's hand, along with 2 of his fingers. He howled in pain, clutching his maimed hand. "You devil woman! You're worse than your father ever was!" "No," Clara replied calmly, keeping her distance. "Just better prepared. You came here thinking you were hunting a farmer's daughter. But you forgot something crucial, Jed. Sometimes the prey is actually the predator." Around them, the surviving members of Jed's gang lay groaning or unconscious. Snake Eye Pete was trying to crawl toward his dropped gun, but another warning shot from Clara convinced him otherwise. "You think this ends here?" Jed snarled, though his bravado was cracking. "There'll be others. Word's already spread about you. Every gunslinger from here to Mexico will want to test themselves against John Whitmore's daughter." Clara's smile was cold in the lantern light. "Good. Let them come. Each one that tries will serve as a reminder to the others." She moved closer, her gun unwavering. "But you, Jed Crowley, won't be around to see it. You made your choice when you killed my father." The night air grew thick with tension as Clara and Jed faced each other, 5 years of history hanging between them. In his eyes, she saw the same arrogance that had cost her father his life. In hers, he saw his own mortality staring back. "Before you pull that trigger," Jed said, his voice taking on a desperate edge, "you should know something about your father's death." His eyes gleamed with malicious intent, searching for any advantage in his final moments. Clara's stance remained steady, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "Nothing you can say will change what's about to happen, Jed." "He begged," Jed spat, his words dripping with venom. "Your mighty father, the legendary John Whitmore, begged for his life that night. Offered us everything he had just to stay alive. Some legend he turned out to be." The lie hung in the air like smoke, meant to cloud Clara's judgment, to make her angry and careless. But 5 years of preparation had taught her patience. She saw the manipulation for what it was, the last desperate ploy of a cornered man. "You're wrong," Clara replied, her voice steady as steel. "I found him that morning, saw how many of your men he took with him. Count the empty shells that told the true story." Her finger tightened slightly on the trigger. "He died standing, fighting, protecting what was his, just like he lived." Jed's face contorted with rage as his final attempt to shake her failed. "Then finish it!" he screamed. "Prove you're just as cold-blooded as he was. Show everyone what kind of monster John Whitmore raised." Clara took a slow, deliberate breath. "That's your final mistake, Jed. Thinking this is about proving something." The barrel of her gun caught the lantern light. This isn't about reputation or revenge. It's about justice, for my father and for everyone else you've hurt." "You can't kill me in cold blood," Jed sneered, though fear flickered in his eyes. "You're not your father. You're just a girl playing with guns." "You're right about one thing," Clara agreed softly. "I'm not my father. I'm better." Jed's hand flashed to his boot again, revealing a second hidden knife. But Clara had been waiting for exactly this moment. Her shot cracked through the night air with devastating precision, finding its mark before Jed's blade could clear leather. The notorious outlaw slumped against the barn wall, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Impossible," he whispered, looking down at the spreading red stain on his chest. "No one's that fast." "Not impossible," Clara corrected him, watching as life faded from his eyes. "Just well practiced." As Jed Crowley breathed his last, the night seemed to exhale with him. The tension that had built over 5 years finally broke, leaving behind a strange sense of completion. Clara lowered her gun, feeling the weight of the moment settle around her like a heavy blanket. Sheriff Morgan's voice cut through the silence. "We heard the shots from town." He and several deputies emerged from the darkness, lanterns casting jumping shadows across the scene. The lawman surveyed the carnage with a mixture of awe and respect. "Though from the looks of things, you didn't need our help." Dawn broke over the Whitmore farm, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed almost inappropriate for the night's events. The sheriff's men were still clearing away the aftermath, loading the dead into wagons and securing the wounded for transport to the jail in Silver Creek. A crowd had gathered at the edge of the property, drawn by the news that spread through town like wildfire. The infamous Crowley gang had met their end at the hands of Clara Whitmore, the quiet farmer's daughter they'd all underestimated. 6 dead, 4 wounded, Sheriff Morgan reported, closing his notebook, including Jed Crowley himself. "You've done what 3 territories worth of lawmen couldn't, Clara." He studied her with newfound respect. "Though I reckon that was your plan all along." Clara stood on her porch, watching the proceedings with calm detachment. She'd cleaned her guns and put them away, once again looking every bit the simple farmer's daughter in her plain dress and work apron. But no one would ever make the mistake of seeing only that again. "Wasn't planning anything, Sheriff," she replied softly. "Just protecting what's mine, same as my father would have done." She paused, looking at the spot where Jed had fallen. "Though I won't deny I've been preparing for something like this since the day he died." Martha from the general store pushed through the crowd, carrying a basket of fresh bread and preserves. "You'll be needing breakfast, dear," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Can't tend to the farm on an empty stomach, even after all this." Others followed Martha's lead, bringing food, offers of help with the farm work, and their own quiet words of support. The town that had once viewed Clara with mild curiosity now looked at her with a mixture of awe and gratitude. The Crowley gang had terrorized the region for years, and she had ended their reign in a single night. "What happens now?" young Tommy Baker asked, voicing the question on everyone's mind. "Will there be others coming? More outlaws seeking revenge?" Clara turned to face the gathered crowd, her expression serene but determined. "Maybe," she acknowledged, "but they'll find the same welcome the Crowleys did if they try." Her hand absently touched the worn grip of the gun she still wore, even now. "This is my home, my father's legacy. I aim to protect it." Sheriff Morgan cleared his throat. "Territory Marshal's gonna want to speak with you about all this. Might even offer you a badge given what you've done here." But Clara was already shaking her head. "I'm not looking for a badge or a title, Sheriff. I'm just a farmer's daughter who learned to shoot straight and think ahead." She looked out over her land where the morning sun was burning away the last shadows of night. "This farm is all I want. This land, these people, they're worth protecting." The crowd began to disperse as the morning wore on, each person carrying with them a story they'd tell for years to come. The story of how Clara Whitmore, underestimated and overlooked, had become something more than just a legend. Word of what happened at the Whitmore farm spread across the frontier like a prairie fire. Each retelling grew more dramatic than the last, though the truth itself was remarkable enough. In saloons and trading posts throughout the territory, people spoke in hushed tones about the farmer's daughter who'd outshot the infamous Crowley gang. "Heard she can shoot a bullet clean through another bullet in midair," a traveler claimed in a Denver saloon. "Saw her do it myself outside Silver Creek." "That ain't nothing," another would counter. "My cousin says she once shot a rattlesnake between the eyes at 50 paces in the dark without even looking up from her book." The stories grew taller with each passing week, but Clara paid them no mind. She continued tending her farm, selling vegetables in town, living the same quiet life she always had. Only now, people noticed things they'd missed before. The way she moved with liquid grace, how her eyes constantly scanned her surroundings, the practiced ease with which she wore her father's gun. Outlaws and bandits began giving Silver Creek a wide berth. The mere mention of Clara Whitmore's name was enough to make them seek easier targets. Those foolish enough to ignore the warnings found themselves facing a choice: leave peacefully or end up like the Crowleys. "Never seen anything like it," Marshal Jenkins told his superiors in a written report. "One woman's reputation for keeping the peace is better than a whole company of lawmen. Folks around Silver Creek sleep easier knowing she's watching over things." Young women from neighboring towns started making pilgrimages to the Whitmore farm, hoping to catch a glimpse of Clara or perhaps learn her secrets. She received them all with the same quiet grace, offering simple advice that went beyond just shooting. "Being underestimated is a gift," she'd tell them. "Let them think you're weak. Let them think you're helpless. Then be ready to prove them wrong when it matters most." Even the territorial governor heard the tales. He sent an official letter offering Clara a position as a special deputy marshal, which she politely declined. "My place is here," she wrote back. "This land was worth dying for to my father. To me, it's worth living for and protecting." But not everyone celebrated her rising legend. In distant saloons and hidden camps, other outlaws watched and waited, seeing Clara as a challenge to be conquered. Some dreamed of making their own names by taking down the famous Clara Whitmore. Others sought revenge for friends who'd fallen to her guns. None of this concerned Clara. She'd learned patience from years of farming, strategy from her father's teachings, and wisdom from surviving on her own. Each morning she would stand on her porch at dawn, watching the sun rise over her land, ready for whatever the day might bring. "Your pa would be proud," Sheriff Morgan told her one afternoon, watching her instruct a group of young women in the basics of self-defense. "Though I reckon he'd be a bit surprised at how far you've come." Clara smiled, remembering her father's words. "It's not about being the fastest or the strongest, Clara. It's about being the smartest and the most prepared." The first warning came on a quiet Tuesday morning, carried by a dust-covered rider who'd pushed his horse hard to reach Silver Creek. Clara was at her usual spot in the market, arranging fresh tomatoes, when the man stumbled up to her stand. "Miss Whitmore!" he gasped, still catching his breath. "Thought you ought to know. Marcus Dead-Eye Davidson is heading this way. Been asking about you in every town from here to Kansas City." Clara's hands never paused in their work, but her eyes sharpened at the name. Dead-Eye Davidson was no common outlaw. He was a bounty hunter with a reputation as lethal as her own, known for bringing in his targets dead more often than alive. "He's different from the others, Clara," Sheriff Morgan warned later that day, his weathered face creased with concern. "Davidson's not some glory-seeking gunslinger. He's methodical, patient, studies his targets for weeks before making a move." "Like a hunter stalking prey," Clara mused, remembering her father's lessons about mountain lions and their habits. "Good, then he'll appreciate the same courtesy." Over the next few days, reports trickled in of Davidson's approach. He was taking his time, interviewing people who'd witnessed her showdown with the Crowley gang, studying the layout of her farm from distant hillsides. "Let me post some deputies at your farm," the sheriff offered. Man like that, you can't face him alone." But Clara shook her head, a familiar calm settling over her. "This is exactly what my father prepared me for, Sheriff. Davidson wants to study me? Let him. He'll learn what the Crowleys learned. Some prey bites back." She made no obvious changes to her routine, but those who knew her best noticed subtle adjustments. Her morning target practice sessions moved to different locations each day. She spent more time in town, always in open spaces with clear lines of sight. Every move was calculated to reveal nothing while learning everything. Word came that Davidson had set up camp in the hills overlooking her farm. Clara received the news with the same unflappable demeanor she showed everything else. But at night, she added new preparations to her defenses, remembering every lesson her father had taught her about facing a hunter who thought like she did. "He's playing a waiting game," old Pete observed one evening, watching Clara calmly tend her garden, despite knowing Davidson's scope might be trained on her that very moment. "Trying to wear down your nerves." "Then he's already made his first mistake," Clara replied, carefully pruning a tomato plant. "My father taught me that patience isn't just about waiting. It's about being ready when the waiting ends." As the sun set that evening, Clara stood on her porch, seemingly exposed but knowing exactly which shadows could hide a threat. Somewhere in the distant hills, Davidson was watching, planning, thinking he was the hunter. "Come ahead, Mr. Davidson," she whispered to the gathering dusk. "Let's see who's really the hunter and who's the prey." The confrontation with Dead-Eye Davidson came neither at dawn or dusk, as most would expect, but in the stark light of high noon. Clara was in her garden, the summer sun beating down, when she heard the deliberate crunch of boots on the path. Davidson stood at her gate, his black duster coated with trail dust, his reputation wrapped around him like armor. He was older than most expected, with silver-streaked hair and eyes that had seen too much death. "Miss Whitmore," he called out, his voice carrying the weight of years. "I believe you've been expecting me." Clara straightened slowly, brushing dirt from her apron. "For 11 days, she replied calmly. "You've been watching from the North Ridge, studying my routines, though yesterday you moved to the East Hill for a better angle." A flicker of surprise crossed Davidson's weathered face. "You knew?" "I knew the moment you arrived." Clara's hand remained deliberately away from her gun. "The question is, why are you here? There's no bounty on my head, no reward for taking me down." Davidson's laugh was hollow. "Some prizes aren't measured in dollars, Miss Whitmore. Some are about proving who's best." His hand hovered near his holster. "They say you're the fastest gun west of the Mississippi." "They say a lot of things," Clara responded, her voice steady. "Most aren't true. The rest don't matter." "Then let's find out what is true." Davidson's eyes narrowed. "Unless you're afraid to face someone who studied your every move." Clara finally moved, but not toward her gun. Instead, she picked up her watering can and began tending to her tomatoes. "Mr. Davidson, my father taught me that a smart warrior only fights when they have to. Do you have to?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. For a long moment, the only sound was water trickling into sun-baked soil. Finally, Davidson's hand dropped from his gun. "They also say you're wise beyond your years," he said softly. "I came here looking for a legend to challenge. Instead, I found something rarer, a warrior who understands that the greatest victory is the battle avoided." Clara set down her watering can and faced him fully. "There's coffee on the stove," she said, "and I believe we both have stories worth sharing." That evening, folks in town saw an unusual sight. Clara Whitmore and Dead-Eye Davidson sitting on her porch, sharing coffee and quiet conversation as the sun set. Two legends, each having chosen peace over pride. If you've been moved by Clara's story of courage, wisdom, and knowing when to fight and when to stand down, share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever faced a challenge that required more wisdom than strength? Tell us about a time when you choose peace over pride. Your story might inspire others, just as Clara's has inspired so many. Remember to subscribe for more tales of extraordinary people who changed their world in unexpected ways. Until next time, remember Clara's wisdom. Sometimes the greatest strength lies not in the battles we fight, but in the ones we choose to avoid.